Life isn't always fair. In fact, a lot of times it seems like it's being very unfair to us. That we can lay out some plans and try to move forward, and then life just throws us a curveball and ruins everything that we had planned at no fault of our own, it seems like. For me particularly, it seems like life has been very unfair when it comes to the cars that I've owned, because I've owned 4 different cars within the last 4 years because of problems I've had with the cars. And the last 2 cars in particular have seemed really unfair, because 2 cars ago, the air conditioner wasn't working on that car. So I took it into the mechanics shop so that they could fix the air conditioner. And about a week after it was fixed and I got it out of the shop, about a week later, the timing belt broke, which completely ruined the car and I wasn't able to repair it. And I was thinking, why couldn't this have happened the week before I took it in to the shop instead of the week after? And the same kind of thing happened with this last car that I owned. The tires on it were leaking air, and I was trying to put it off as long as I could, but eventually it was leaking air so bad that I was like, okay, I need to go put new tires on it. So I took it in and got some new tires on it, and wouldn't you know, a few weeks later, I get into a car accident. No fault of my own, it was completely the other driver's fault, but he hit me and it totaled the car and it was completely ruined. So both of these last 2 cars, it's just seemed really unfair that I was trying to take care of the car, I was trying to make sure that it would last, and I put the money in, and right after I put money in, it gets totaled and ruined and I can't use it anymore. And it's situations like that that show up in our lives that can be really frustrating, because it just seems like you're trying to do everything right and nothing is working out. And it really seems like life is out to get you, and that you just can't make any progress no matter what you do. So what do we do when we're faced with something like that? Because it's not like dealing with a person where you can deal with the situation, or dealing with a problem that you have on your own, that, maybe you just need some discipline to work through it, because it really seems like it's just life trying to get you. So what do you do in those situations? Well, I want us to look at a person that life wasn't treating him very fair. In fact, life was very unfair for him and his people. Now, this man's name was Gideon, and you can find his story in the Bible, in the book of Judges, chapters 6 and 7. But what was going on with Gideon? I'll go ahead and share the whole story, because I'm not going to focus on the story as a whole today. Instead, I want to talk about the pieces that make up this story and how it applies to dealing with situations where it seems like life is unfair. So the story itself, if you're not familiar, is that there's an army out against Israel, and God appoints Gideon to lead an army of Israelites against this other army, the Midianites. So God instructs Gideon to put an army together, and then after the army's put together, God tells him it's too many, and he keeps sending people home until Gideon is down to just 300 men. And Gideon then takes the 300 men, and God gives him a strategy to use that allows him to overthrow the Midianite army with just 300 men. So it's a really cool story, and if you haven't read it, I highly encourage that you read through it. Amazing story about how following God's instructions and trusting God can bring you through just about any situation. But I want us to look right now at what exactly the situation was that Gideon felt trapped in, and how life seemed to be unfair for him. So we find it in Judges chapter 6, and I want to start reading at verse 2. It says, "Because the power of Midian was so oppressive, the Israelites prepared shelters for themselves in mountain clefts, caves, and strongholds. Whenever the Israelites planted their crops, the Midianites, Amalekites, and other eastern peoples invaded the country. They camped on the land and ruined the crops all the way to Gaza, and did not spare a living thing for Israel, neither sheep, nor cattle, nor donkeys. They came up with their livestock in their tents like swarms of locusts. It was impossible to count them or their camels. They invaded the land to ravage it. Midian so impoverished the Israelites that they cried out to the Lord for help. This is the situation we find Gideon and the other Israelites in. Even though they weren't attacking the Midianites would come in, destroy their crops, kill their livestock, ruin their way of living. And if we were Gideon in this time, this would seem really unfair. Because you would think, I'm not attacking these people, we're not attacking these people, we're just trying to get by. But we can't make any progress, we can't get by, because whenever we try, these people just come in and ruin all of our stuff. They ruin our crops, kill our livestock. We can't eat, we can't sustain ourselves, and it's at no fault of our own. That's how you would feel. So what did Gideon do in this situation? What did the Israelites do? Because what they do can apply to what we can do in our situations. So let's continue reading from verse 7. It says, "When the Israelites cried out to the Lord because of Midian, he sent them a prophet who said, 'This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I brought you up out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. I rescued you from the hand of the Egyptians, and I delivered you from the hand of all your oppressors. I drove them out before you and gave you their land. I said to you, I am the Lord your God. Do not worship the gods of the Amorites, in whose land you live, but you have not listened to me.'" And actually, if we go back to the start of this chapter, in verse 1, it says, "The Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and for 7 years he gave them into the hands of the Midianites." So if you were Gideon and the Israelites, from your perspective, it seems like life is not fair because of no fault to your own. You're not attacking the Midianite people, and yet they come in and destroy your way of living. But when you go back further and look at how they got into this situation, it was because they abandoned the God who protected them up to this point. God had brought them out of Egypt, gave them instructions not to worship the gods of the Amorites, and yet they didn't listen to God. They abandoned him, and because of that, they lost the protection of the God that had been protecting them up to this point. And so when life seems like it's not fair, the first thing you want to do is to try to find a cause for the situation that you're dealing with. Because there's a good chance that even though it feels like there's nothing you can do, usually there have been decisions that have led up to this point. Maybe the situations you're dealing with now, one after another, don't seem fair, but when you take a step back and look at what has caused these issues to happen and how you've gotten into these situations, that a lot of the time the situation itself could have been avoided if you had taken the proper steps beforehand to avoid that situation. So we need to look for the cause and identify what is causing these situations that I'm getting into that seem so unfair. And is it something that I'm doing that I can fix? If we look at the story of David and Goliath, that's a classic Bible tale about how little shepherd boy David comes and faces the great giant Goliath, and he's able to bring him down with just a sling and five stones, but he only uses one of them, and just a sling and a stone takes down the giant Goliath. It's an amazing story. But have you ever thought about it from Goliath's perspective? That here he is, 9 feet tall, champion of the Philistine people. And he's standing there, wearing his armor, holding his giant spear and shield. And coming out to meet him in battle is this little shepherd boy, wearing no armor, and who's only holding a sling and some stones. And yet, that little boy defeats Goliath. From Goliath's perspective, that is really not fair. He was prepared, he had all the advantages, and yet somehow David defeats him. From Goliath's perspective, that's not fair. But when you look back and realize that the Philistine army was coming against God's protected people, Goliath had put himself into a situation where he thought he had the advantage, but in reality, he was at a disadvantage because he was fighting against the people that God was protecting. And so, yes, it seemed unfair to him, but that's because he didn't realize the cause for why he lost that battle. He had to step further out, look at the bigger picture, and realize that it was the decisions made up to that point that caused his failure, not his decisions in the battle that seemed unfair, but his decisions leading up to that point. Let's use this example. Let's say that you've been hired by a company and been working for them for 5 years. Just 5 years working at this company, working faithfully, doing your best. And then they hire a new employee, and within 6 months, this new employee receives a promotion and pay raise. Now, from your perspective, you're saying, boy, that seems really unfair. You've been here 5 years, and yet in 6 months, they're getting a promotion and a raise where you haven't received anything. But if you look at that same situation from different eyes, maybe the employer's eyes, maybe he sees that you honestly haven't been doing as good of a job as you thought, and that this new employee that comes along is working harder, he's staying late, and doing overall a better job than you. And so he gives that new employee the promotion and a raise because they've earned it. And from your perspective, it seems unfair because you've been there longer. But maybe you have to realize a cause that they were given that promotion because they worked harder than you've been working the last 5 years. And it's things like that that's difficult to admit because we always seem right in our own eyes. And we have the assumption that things should go well for us. And then when things don't go well for us, it seems unfair. But we have to realize that life cannot go our way and still be fair. In fact, life is usually fair, but from our perspective, it just doesn't seem that way. I mean, if you were playing a coin flip game and you bet on heads, put money down that the coin would come up heads, and it comes up tails 3 times in a row, that feels really unfair. But just because it was unfair for you doesn't mean that the rules of the game were consistent. Because every time that a coin comes up 3 times tails in a row, there will be another time when it comes up 3 times heads in a row. It may seem unfair to you, but the rules stay consistent. So when life throws something our way that doesn't seem fair, instead of just assuming it's not fair because it's against us, instead we should look at the situation, figure out what caused the situation, step back, take a bigger look at it, and there's a good chance that we'll find that really the situation wasn't being unfair to us. We just didn't recognize the decisions that we were making to get into that situation. We have to look for the cause. What is causing the situations we're getting in? So then once you've identified the cause, what do you do after that? How do you deal with the cause? Maybe you're not even the cause of it. Maybe somebody else and their actions is what's causing it. So either way, what do you do once you identify the cause? Well, let's go back to Gideon. So he was in this tough situation, and God calls him out and says, I'm going to give you an army, and you're going to use this army to fight off the Midianites. And so we go over to chapter 7 now, and starting in verse 1, it says, Early in the morning, Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all his men camped at the spring of Harod. The camp of Midian was north of them in the valley near the hill of Moreh. The Lord said to Gideon, You have too many men. I cannot deliver Midian into your hands, or Israel would boast against me. My own strength has saved me. So God is saying, I have to take this army you have, and we've got to dwindle it down which he does to eventually 300 men, dwindle it down. Why? Because otherwise the Israelites would say, we won this battle through our own strength. And in doing so, what they would do would abandon God again, saying, we did this through our own power, we don't need God anymore. And if you remember, that is exactly what caused them to get into this situation in the first place, was that they abandoned God, started trusting in their own decisions, ended up in this bad situation. And God is saying, we're going to win this battle with only 300 men, not with a huge army, so that Israel can't boast saying they did it through their own power. Instead, they have to recognize that it was God who saw them through it. Why? Because he wants them to avoid the same mistakes that they were making before that got them into this situation. And that's the second important thing to do when it seems like life is being unfair. Once you've identified the cause, you have to avoid making the same mistakes, making the same decisions that got you into that situation. And this works even if it was somebody else's actions that are the cause of the situations you're getting in. Because if you've identified that their decisions are the cause, then you can still avoid the situation that their decisions are creating and find ways to get around that situation. But if you keep doing what you've always done, you're going to keep running into the same situations that seem like they're out to get you. You have to stop making the same decisions that got you into the situation last time, because you don't want to end up in that situation again. You want to avoid that situation, so you have to change what you're doing. And it's going to be difficult because we like to do what comes easiest to us. But what comes easiest to us is what got us in this situation last time, so we need to identify that got us there and do something different, not repeating the same mistakes. Now, someone who couldn't get this through their head was Samson. If you're familiar with this story, Samson and Delilah, Samson was a man of God who made a covenant with God that he would never cut his hair, and a few other things, but notably he wouldn't cut his hair, and because of that, God granted him supernatural strength. Now, he married Delilah, who was a Philistine, one of Israelites' enemies, and Delilah did everything in her power to figure out the source of Samson's strength in order to take that strength away from him so that her people could overthrow him. And she tried multiple times, Samson, tell me your secret, and he'd tell her a lie, and she would try to do that. And then later on, oh, you lied to me, Samson, tell me what the secret is, and did this over and over and over again. And Samson, throughout this whole time, kept Delilah around. Even though Delilah was clearly trying to take away his strength, he still kept Delilah around, and it eventually led to his downfall. He kept doing the same thing, making the same mistake, and it led to his ruin. You have to stop doing the same thing. Even if it works for a little while, you're able to get by for a short time making that decision, you know that eventually it's going to catch up to you. Could you imagine somebody that didn't want to win a jackpot at a casino, and yet went there every single day and played the slot machines, saying, oh, it's okay because there's such a small chance that I'm going to hit the jackpot, so it's okay for me to continue to, play the slot machine because it's not going to happen. And he does it every day, and then eventually one day he hits the jackpot and gets all upset because, whoa, how did this happen to me? That's not fair. The odds were totally in my favor. This shouldn't have happened. But he's getting upset because it did happen. He continued to play the risks and thinking that he could get away with it, even though he knew that there was a risk involved. Samson knew that Delilah was trying to get him, and yet he kept her around. They played the risk, even though in the end it wasn't fair, right? the person that wins the jackpot, the odds were in their favor. Or with Samson, he had kept Delilah around that long, had kept his secret from her for that long. Why wasn't he able to keep it up? The point is, if you keep making the same mistakes, eventually it's going to come around and bite you. You have to stop doing what you've been doing all along, because you're just going to keep running into the same situation that in the moment the situation seems unfair, but really it's the decisions that you've been making up to that point. So what do? You need to either accept and prepare for the risk or change your action altogether to avoid it. Because there's some things that you still have to do, right? With my car, I still have to drive. I do that to get around. But I need to accept the risk that the car could break down or somebody could hit me, and I need to plan according to that. Even though when it happens, it seems completely out of my control, I can still prepare for that moment if I understand that there's a risk of it happening. But if it's a situation that I can avoid altogether, then I should do that too. If I have a problem with alcohol, I'm a heavy drinker, and every time I get really drunk, something terrible happens that's beyond my control, then I should avoid situations where I would drink heavily and take precautions to keep that from happening. Either way, you either accept the risk and prepare for it, or you change your actions to avoid it altogether, because you can't afford to do what you've been doing all along and making the same mistakes that get you into the same situation. A change has to be made. Now, not only do you have to stop doing what you've been doing up to that point, but you also have to do something proactive to deal with the situation. So going back to Gideon, God eventually brings his army down to 300, and they're setting off to fight the Midianite army. And I want us to look at how God uses the army to defeat the Midianites. So this is again in chapter 7, and we're going to start reading from verse 19. It says, Gideon and the 100 men with him reached the edge of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch, just after they had changed the guard. They blew their trumpets and broke the jars that were in their hands. The 3 companies blew the trumpets and smashed the jars. Grasping the torches in their left hands and holding in their right hands the trumpets they were to blow, they shouted, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." While each man held his position around the camp, all the Midianites ran, crying out as they fled. When the 300 trumpets sounded, the Lord caused the men throughout the camp to turn on each other with their swords. The army fled to Bethshittah, toward Zererah, as far as the border of Abel-Mahalah, near Tabath. So, what happens? The 300 men in Gideon's army, they don't rush into the Midianite camp. Even though it's the dead of night, they're all sleeping. You would think, strategically, they've got the advantage to run into the camp and try to kill as many as they could as they're waking up. But God instead gives them this strategy to surround the camp, smash the jars, play the trumpet, shout, "Gideon's upon you." And through doing that, the men from the Midianite army panicked and were so overcome with fear that they began cutting at everyone around them and essentially killing themselves out of the fear that was instilled upon them. Amazing strategy that God uses here. But the point that I want us to see in regards to what we've been talking about is that when Gideon was faced with this situation, he didn't attack the army head on. Instead, he came at it from a different angle. He found a different approach that was more effective than the approach that would have been used in the past. He didn't just rush in and attack them. He found something new that gave him an even better advantage. And this is what we have to do with the situations that life throws our way. We face them, they seem unfair, we figure out what the cause is, we stop doing what we were doing to get ourselves in that situation, and then we also look for a new way to get around that situation. We change our actions, find something new to do, so that we don't keep ending up in those bad situations. Because there's always an option B. There are always different options available to us. As the saying goes, there's more than one way to skin a cat, right? Saying, just because you've done something one way and it's not working, doesn't mean that there's not another way to try to do it. You can always find new ways to deal with a situation. When Jesus was doing his ministry, there was one time when he was speaking in this house, and the house was filled up with a large crowd of people. Nobody could get in. And there was a man who was paralyzed that wanted to get up to Jesus to be healed. And he had, 4 friends that were carrying him on a mat, but they couldn't get into the house and up to Jesus because it was so crowded. Now, they could have just gone, well, it looks like we can't get in there, so we're not going to make it. No, instead, they took the man up onto the roof, dug a hole into the roof, and lowered the man down in front of Jesus, and Jesus healed him. They looked at the situation, realized that the standard approach wouldn't work, and so they looked for a different approach that would allow them to accomplish what they were setting out to do. And we have to be able to do that. We have to be flexible. Look at what we are trying to accomplish, realize that what we're doing now isn't accomplishing that task, and instead look for new areas, new ways to accomplish that task, different routes we can take. What is option B? What is option C? And that's how you deal with life throwing you tough situations that mess up the plans that you had laid out. You look for a new plan. I had to do that just in my own personal ministry. I felt at a very young age that I was called to be a pastor. And so I grew up and I went to college and I got a degree in pastoral studies and I got my credentials and I was ready to go out and do God's work in the church. And I have since discovered that churches across the nation are failing. They're shrinking, they're closing their doors because they aren't reaching people anymore. So here I am with a lot of student debt and a degree in pastoral studies and the credentials to be a pastor, and I'm faced with a situation where the standard church and the pastors doing what they've always done are no longer reaching people. And I've had to recognize that there needs to be something new that is reaching people, something that is different. What is my option B when it comes to doing my ministry? And that's honestly what led to this podcast, was I was looking for something that would work, that was different than what I was setting out to do. Because it would have been really easy for me to say, well, this is what I prepared for, this is what I've always had in mind, and I'm just going to try to do it anyway and do or die. Well, that probably wouldn't have worked out so well. Instead, I'm looking at new avenues. What is the best way to approach this situation to be as successful as possible? Because if what we're doing now isn't working, then it's time to try something new. You don't want to beat your head against a wall that isn't going to break. You want to find a path that goes around the wall. So life throws us situations that seem unfair all the time. But instead of sitting and wishing that life was more fair for us, we should instead reevaluate our situation. What are we doing to get into these situations? What are the cause of these tough times that we face? And then, what do we have to stop doing to avoid those situations? And what can we do instead to help go around those situations? What's something new, a new possibility that we could look into to avoid those situations in the future? Learn from it, grow from it, stop doing what you were doing to get into it, identify what that was, and look for something new to get around it. Thank you for taking the time to listen. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Sermon in the Pocket. As always, you can keep the discussion going by contacting me through our Facebook page or email, Sermon in the Pocket. And if you like what I'm doing and want to support the show, look us up on Patreon and sponsor us there. But either way, I hope you enjoyed this and have a wonderful day.